From outsider to incumbent, Donald Trump launches his re-election bid after a 2016 campaign that buried his opponents in insults. President Trump's first term is still sending shockwaves at home and abroad. So how will he fight off his challenges for 2020? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, few, including Donald Trump himself, expected him to win the US presidential election in 2016. Now he's well into his first term and is campaigning hard for a second in 2020.
I stand before you to officially launch my campaign for a second term as President of the United States.
Well, he launched his re-election bid in Florida, a swing state that he must win. He didn't offer new policies during the rally, but he again attacked what he called the fake news media and the political establishment for undermining him and his supporters. Opinion polls suggest President Trump could lose to some of the possible Democratic challengers like Joe Biden, but Election Day is still 16 months away. Right, let's have a look back now at some of the things that Donald Trump promised he'd do during his first term.
Together, we will make America great again. I will build a great, great wall on our southern border, and I will have Mexico pay for that wall. Mark my words. One of the worst deals I've ever seen is the Iran deal. My administration has already imposed new sanctions on Iran, and I will do more to prevent Iran from ever developing, ever, a nuclear weapon. I am committed to trying to achieve a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I intend to do everything I can to help them achieve that goal.
So this is what the president has delivered: a growing economy and the employment rate at a 50-year low. The border wall with Mexico is far from finished, despite the longest government shutdown in US history, and Mexico is certainly not paying for it. The president kept his promise to pull the US out of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Since then, Trump's reimposed sanctions to further squeeze Iran's oil-dependent economy and sent extra troops, warplanes and ships to the Gulf, raising fears of an accidental conflict. And the much-anticipated so-called deal of the century between the Israelis and the Palestinians remains a mystery to many. The Palestinians say they want nothing to do with it. All right, let's introduce our panel now. In Washington, D.C., we have Joel Rubin, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. In Raleigh, in North Carolina, we have Lauren Zelt, who's a conservative strategist, as well as the founder and chief executive of Zelt Communications. Also in Washington, we have Rashawn Ray, assistant professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. Welcome to you all. And Lauren, can I start with you? Donald Trump promised to make America great again, 2.5 years or so into his first term. Has he succeeded for you?
Well, I think the most important thing as he launches his re-election campaign that people are going to be looking at is the strength of the economy. Unemployment is at a 50-year low, and one of the most important issues for voters in every single election is how their pocketbook looks. And I think that with the strength of the economy, I think that he is well positioned to go into his re-election campaign. Unemployment is down. Our finances as a country, aside from our massive rising government debt that we do need to address shortly and swiftly, our financial health is good in the United States. And, I think that is the biggest hurdle facing any Democrat that he will come up against in the general election.
It's the economy, stupid, famously said, of course, by a previous president of yours. But what about issues of community relations, for instance? What about the tensions that we often hear about between the various more marginalised groups?
That is a significant factor. You know, I think that this is one of the most polarized times in our nation's history, certainly in my lifetime, and I think absolutely in recent memory. And I think what you're seeing is that is really stopping Congress from passing a lot of legislation that is very important, things such as comprehensive immigration reform and others, because our country is becoming further and further apart and more polarized. So I think that in politics, you often see things swing like a pendulum. And I think that I'm hoping at the apex of the polarization in our country. And I think that if we are going to get more things done for the American people, that we're going to have to come together. And I think a lot of the onus on this is on the Democrats and who they choose to nominate for their presidential candidate. I think that if they nominate someone like a Joe Biden, who is more of a moderate, who has a history of working across the aisle, I think that there is a chance that he could beat President Trump. And I do think that someone like him has the possibility of bringing folks together.
Let's talk about the Democrats a little bit later on. In the meantime, let's go to Washington and talk to Rashawn. Rashawn, as a young professional black man, how is Trump's America for you? I know you've also got a family.
Well, you know, I think that's what's interesting. I mean, the comments that we just heard, I think in an ideal world, that becomes the ideal. But unfortunately, that's not the reality for a lot of people. So the unemployment rate is being touted as something that Trump should hang his hat on. Unfortunately, what we see is that the unemployment rate is still over double for black young adults relative to white young adults. So for white young adults who are, say, 20 to 24, the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that the unemployment rate is slightly over 6%. But for African Americans, the unemployment rate is over 14%. So while we see this growth in manufacturing jobs around the country, we're not seeing this growth in manufacturing jobs in places like St. Louis, Memphis, Detroit, Baltimore. I mean, we're not necessarily seeing these jobs come back to these particular communities. Crime is still a problem in these particular areas. Education is still a problem in these particular areas. And then when we couple that with the rhetoric of Trump, in the fact that of the places where he did a campaign rally, I mean, I think about what happened last night in Florida, where there was a packed stadium that people have to be realistic about. And part of what I seen wasn't just tons of people coming out, but it's the fact that the statistic that in places where Trump held a rally, that hate crimes increased 200% in those particular areas. I think for marginalized groups, for African Americans in the United States, they face a very different reality. And what they worry about and what they've seen over the past 2.5 years is that when people say, make America great again, what we see is who is it being made great again for? And unfortunately, we see for groups like African Americans, for Latinos, for even people who are part of the LGBTQ community, we see that these marginalized groups are being left out.
Right, OK. Joel, so we've heard very contrasting assessments of America at home. Looking at it now from abroad, I think there might be perhaps more consensus. We've had President Trump, of course, as we've mentioned, withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, taken the US out of the Paris Climate Accord, just to name a few. He's basically eschewed multilateralism in favour of more bilateral relations. I mean, how does it look to you globally?
Yeah, Martine, President Trump has destroyed American credibility. Let's just be very direct about that. The latest episode with Iran is a perfect example where it's quite likely that Iran did provide an ordinance or did attack the oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. But the world doesn't believe us in that assessment. And that's very dangerous for the United States. So be it climate change, be it global tariffs, which we can get to about how that's harming American economic growth here right now in the moment. And of course, diplomacy, as you're describing, related to Iran, the Middle East. The American word is diminished deeply now under this president. Countries just don't trust us in terms of what we say we're going to do and how we're going to do it.
And staying with you, Joel, because hand in hand, seemingly, with this campaign of maximum pressure against Iran, seems to be an ever deepening, an ever strengthening, if you like, of relations with Saudi Arabia. Is this actually a gear change under the Trump presidency, or is he just articulating more loudly, more vociferously, what has been US policy for a very long time indeed?
Yeah, you know, the American-Saudi relationship goes back nearly 7 decades. This is not a new relationship. What's new, and the feature that is distinctive for President Trump, is that he is picking and biasing towards one side against the others. We've had to balance competitions within the Gulf, be it between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, dealing with Iran, of course, Israel just over the horizon and its concerns related to the Arab world. But right now, this administration seems to be going all in towards one side, and that is putting us in deep strategic danger, particularly when it comes to the conflict zones in Yemen and in Syria, where Americans are essentially funding right now wars that the American people are not really aware of. And this relationship is out of balance, and it doesn't appear like the United States is leading it. And that's very concerning from a national security perspective.
Right. And Lauren, are these the kinds of issues that might affect the way an ordinary American in North Carolina, for instance, the way an ordinary American might vote? The fact that, according to Joel, the US is losing its leadership, its global leadership role. And in fact, people are barely paying much attention to it when it does pronounce on particular events and issues.
Well, I think what you're seeing is that if the situation with Iran, for example, escalates, I do think that will catch people's attention, certainly. If you look past to past elections where, we were engaged in new conflicts, I think about the 2004 election in particular. That is something that people will be thinking about when they head to the ballot box. The only, Joel obviously has a lot of more national security experience than I do, but the only thing that I would push back on is I think that one of the reasons that we are struggling to create a coalition in terms of our Iran policy in particular is that I think a lot of the European leaders are very much resisting the president's efforts because they disagree with his decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. I think that it's pretty clear that the United States would like to enter into a new deal with our allies in Europe and with Iran, but that this administration feels that the deal as it exists is a flawed arrangement. And so what I think you're seeing is you have a lot of our European allies looking for ways around our economic sanctions against Iran. They created something called Instex, for example, which can help them circumnavigate the sanctions. And I frankly think a lot of the leaders in Europe are just waiting to see what happens in 2020 because I think that many of them are hoping that President Trump will be replaced and that they will have someone else to negotiate with.
Right.
Whether that is right or wrong, I disagree with the assessment that we're losing our credibility as a world leader.
I'd like
Go on, Joel. Joel.
I'd like to respond to that. Leadership is defined by leading and those following, and the Europeans aren't following because we're not leading. We actually self-isolated. We had a nuclear agreement with Iran, not perfect, certainly doesn't resolve every single issue, but it was advancing the ball and promoting peace and denuclearization. And the Europeans were on board. We withdrew from that, and the result is, the Europeans, they joined into that deal. And they're not going to just leave it because the United States unilaterally says we're leaving.
All right. I want to get back now to matters closer to home. And Rashawn, we've been hearing from your perspective that of a fairly toxic environment in terms of hate, a rise in hate crime, hate speech, intolerance, and not a very pleasant place to be for many people in the United States. I'm just wondering how far you'd attribute that to the words and utterances of President Trump himself, and indeed to the whole tone of the new campaign that was launched in Florida.
Well, yes, most definitely. I mean, I think the comments that we hear from Trump are very divisive. They're divisive nationally, they're divisive internationally. And I think part of one of the reasons why people felt that they should back him is they perceived him to be a particular type of businessman who could negotiate well. And we've seen that hasn't been the case at all. His strategies simply haven't worked in Washington. His strategies have not worked internationally. And the type of rhetoric that he makes on the campaign trail during whether that be the type of events that he has with his reelection or even just during the time of his presidency is very divisive. Whether or not he's talking about various types of marginalized groups, the comments that he makes about Latinos, the comments that he makes about people who are disabled. And I think what people are seeing is that these comments actually fuel his inability to make better relationships with people, to improve the standing of the United States.
Right, Rashawn, so what do you think then of the start of the new campaign? Did it have the hallmarks of the old campaign? I mean, this is obviously setting the tone as to how he means to go on to the 2020 election. What did you make of it?
Well, I mean, I feel like that is Trump being Trump, and I think part of what we'll see is that throughout this 2020 campaign, we'll start to see, in many ways, him kind of go off the cuff, make statements that people find very offensive, and unfortunately, statements that fuel his base. And I think that's what's key, is that part of the divisiveness isn't simply Trump's rhetoric. It's the fact that people who he's speaking to, who he looks to in the audience, who Trump plays to his audience very, very well. He sees in their eyes, he sees in their reactions that they actually appreciate what he's saying, that they actually like the fact that he's talking about other people, that he's putting them down, that he's talking about essentially discriminating against minorities, discriminating against women, discriminating against people who are out the border, not necessarily having any type of human rights or civil rights type of reactions in terms of viewing other people for their full humanity. And I think what we're seeing at the southwest border is an example of this. I mean, we literally have concentration-like camp structures that are in place in the United States. And I think people need to be realistic about that. This wall that he said he was going to put up hasn't happened. The type of ways that he said he was going to get nuclear weapons out of the Middle East hasn't happened. And I think, unfortunately, what we see is that we might be heading to a war in this next election, and I think that's highly, highly problematic.
All right, Rashawn. Joel, coming back to you, you're part or have been part of the Washington bubble, haven't you? And I'm just wondering, what kind of impact has the changing politics had upon the president himself? He's lost control, obviously, of the House of Representatives. It's gone to the Democrats, and he's got a fairly fearsome opposition number, hasn't he, in the person of Nancy Pelosi? What sort of impact is that having on the politics getting ready for 2020?
Yeah, no, it's funny because I am a Washingtonian now, but I'm from Pittsburgh originally and just visited my hometown synagogue this past weekend. That was a victim of a hate crime in the United States, the attacks at the Tree of Life Synagogue. So that changed the politics, clarified it for many Americans about the dangers that we're in. And Nancy Pelosi, to your question, is understanding that Americans are not comfortable at all with the kind of rhetoric coming from the White House. It's why Democrats won convincingly in 2018. And it's given her wind at the sails, but she's not overconfident. She's not wanting to move towards an impeachment process just yet, although it is gradually moving in that direction. And she's trying to keep the Democrats focused on the core issues that got us the win in 2018, such as health care. When we talk about economic impacts on Americans, the rising cost of health care, no plan from the White House, student college debt, no plan from the White House. These are real bread and butter issues. And so she's trying to get legislation passed, trying to keep the focus on Trump's failures to unify us, and hoping that that carries momentum to whomever is the nominee.
And Lauren, I'm assuming that you would support a Trump second term. Who do you think would, from your perspective and from the president's perspective, who would be the most favoured Democrat to win, to battle for the presidency in 2020? Which candidate would he prefer?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. But one thing I want to make clear is I support a lot of the president's policy, but I absolutely do not support his hateful rhetoric and a lot of the other divisions that he's creating in our country that have led to tragic events like the one that was mentioned in Pittsburgh.
Fair enough.
But on the Democrats, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think that a moderate Democrat like a Joe Biden, you see a lot of people actually really like the policies of Mayor Pete Buttigieg and others in that sort of moderate camp. I think that they have the best chance to defeat the president, especially in the places like Pittsburgh.
I was going to say, but Lauren, I mean, the polls suggest at this point, if it were to be a Joe Biden presidential ticket from the Democratic Party, that he would be the one who could perhaps is most likely to beat Donald Trump. So is that what you'd prefer?
Well, I think that in terms of policy, especially in the economic policy, I like a lot of what has come out of the administration. But what I don't like is how my country is being torn apart right now. And I actually would, possibly prefer to see someone in the White House that could bring us together.
All right.
As a conservative, that's just how I feel personally. But,
Okay.
so yeah, you're seeing not just Joe Biden, though, a lot of other Democrats that could possibly, at this point, defeat President Trump. But again, it's very, very early in the process, and I think it's important to emphasize that.
Sure. Rashawn, it's been pointed out that actually what President Trump himself would prefer would be an Elizabeth Warren type figure, a Bernie Sanders type figure, so that he could depict the campaign as a capitalism versus socialism type of battle.
Yeah, so I tend to think that one of the things that's happening is Trump feels that if people are kind of pushed far left, that he's in a better position. And I'm unsure if that's necessarily the case. I think a lot of the policies of Elizabeth Warren, of a Bernie Sanders, for example, that's pushing us far left, could actually be beneficial for our country. I think part of what's happened on the Democrat side is that as we get more moderate, we tend to actually technically get more conservative in pushing for certain policies. So what that means is if you have a moderate and you have a far-right conservative, what you get is oftentimes policies that tend to be more conservative. Instead, it might be more beneficial to push far left. So the policies that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are pushing, whether that be from student loan forgiveness to various ways that we think about reparations for African Americans, which is the only group in history that haven't received it for systematic discrimination. I think that these pushes are extremely, extremely important. And I think that the American people are going to come out in droves. And I think that's what's key. With U.S. elections, the more people that come out, it favors Democrats. The fewer people that come out, it tends to favor Republicans, at least in this, past 40 or 50 years of the way that the parties are structured. So I think part of what we need is for the Democratic candidates to continue to push certain types of policies, progressive policies, that move the needle back to potentially where it should be so that we start to have more beneficial conversations, that we tend to have more heterogeneous conversations about ideas. Instead of just having two ideas come out, I think we need multiple ideas, and I think Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren gives us that.
Right. And Joel, whoever emerges then from this rather crowded Democratic field of contenders, what can they expect from President Trump? Will it be like 2016, where there were insults hurled left, right and centre? It became vicious. It was incredibly bitter and antagonistic. Should we be expecting the same?
Yeah, there's nothing worse than a child who's spoiled, who sees their candy being taken away. And President Trump, he's the president, and he is not going to like the idea of his not getting a second term. So he's going to be much worse this time than he was the last time. There's no doubt about that. And he's already on the attack. He's using ethnic slurs he has against Elizabeth Warren. I'm not going to repeat what he said because it's beneath us here. And he is trying to find name-calling, third-grade name-calling tags for other candidates. So I think the American people are going to have a real gut check in this election next November about the kind of personality, the kind of ethics, the kind of moral compass that the president has. But Donald Trump is certainly going to use every tool at his disposal to try to undermine, attack, and demean his opponent. And
Lauren, final word to you. Even as a conservative, the prospect of more bad language, more bad behaviour, the normalisation, if you like, of hurling insults around, exaggeration and hyperbole, that's something presumably that you disagree with.
Absolutely. What terrifies me is that this is becoming the new normal. I absolutely disagree with the hateful rhetoric. I think that it has no place in our country, and that I think it is tearing us apart. And the faster that we can stop it, the better. 100%. I am very scared to see what's going on in our country and in some of the other communities mentioned by my fellow guests, the LGBT community, minority communities, certain religious communities, and others. What's happening is wrong, and it needs to stop.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed, all of you. Joel Rubin in Washington, Lauren Zelt in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Rashawn Ray also in Washington. Thank you all very much indeed. And as ever, thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. If you want more discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And there's always a Twitter sphere. At AJ Inside Story is our handle. I'm at Martine Dennis. Thank you once again for joining us, and it's bye for now.